All right. So if I understand correctly, you just submitted homework number 8, right? So you uploaded that to Blackboard. The grader will get on it. Homework 9, you've got a luxurious week to finish that one. You know, gone are the days that you had these back-to-back assignments with real quick turnarounds. This homework 9 is benefit cost analysis, which we're going to start talking about today. So if you do want to get an early start on the assignment, we're going to cover several things today that tie into this homework 9 assignment. Also, the ever-present reminder about the project, which is due on Friday the 19th. So today's the 18th of October. So you've got a month and a day to figure this project out. We've already talked about some good data sources related to salaries. And of course, you know, Google is your friend. You can find so much information just with a quick Google search of additional sources that is just maybe another way to triangulate the information, where if you think you're going to be, for instance, an electrical engineer, you could find some electrical engineering positions with the federal government. You could find some salary data from, you know, a job site like monster.com or Indeed or something like that. You could find some salary data maybe from a company that is posting vacancies and they have like the salaries, or maybe you know a friend who recently graduated. So you've got maybe like 4 different sources of data, and you could average those starting salaries and get an idea. We've talked about some methods that you can use to account for the change in your salary over time, both the cost of living adjustments that you'll get each year, but then also the experience increment and promotions that can cause an increase in salary. And we've talked about how expenses change over time. I came across a website recently that I thought was worth showing to you because it's kind of interesting, that compares and contrasts the cost of living in different cities. So for instance, maybe you are getting cost data for our local area, and you know how much it costs to buy food and your normal living expenses around here, but you suspect that it could be more expensive if you go to live somewhere else. So this nerd wallet has a cost of living calculator, and so let's just compare the nearest area that I think has some pretty representative cost data. They don't have Charleston, they don't have Huntington, but they do have Lexington, Kentucky. Did I spell it wrong? There it is, Lexington, Kentucky. So let's say you currently live in Lexington and you want to live in New York City. Expensive. Manhattan. So if you currently make, let's say, a starting salary of $60,000 in Lexington, you need to maintain your standard of living, you need to make $165,000 in Manhattan. So my goodness, we are spoiled with a favorable cost of living here in the Midwest.
Is that just basically saying, like, if you have like all like different subscriptions and buy different groceries and stuff to keep all the same exact expenses, you have to make that much?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and they break it down a little bit further. So, you know, some of your stuff's going to stay the same. Netflix is what, $12 whether you live in Manhattan or whether you live in Paducah, all right? But certain things are a lot more. So housing costs here, they're saying it's 562% higher. So to get a 2-bedroom in Lexington, $947, and if you searched around, you could probably do better than that, right? 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, $5,000 a month. My goodness. I don't think that you could, I couldn't keep my head afloat there. To buy a home in Lexington, $304,000. Buy a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in Manhattan, $2.2 million. Yeah, so, you know, salaries are higher in Manhattan than they are in Lexington, but the cost of living probably outpaces that. So it goes into some information about transportation costs, food costs, entertainment costs, and so this is one way that you can, excuse me for one second, we're having an ABET accreditation visit right now, and I need to make sure to do class. All right, so back to this. So, you know, it breaks down the food, entertainment, healthcare costs. So this is just one interesting thing if you plan to live elsewhere and want to account for those in your section of the report that deals with expenses. So, you know, like, make this project your own. Wow me with your research. and go out and find sources that say interesting things about income, expenses, retirement. Like I'll show you a couple of websites where you could go get a basic ground level understanding of investment, but I'll be more impressed if you cite some references that I didn't show you. In your report, if you only cite the websites that I illustrated in class, I'll think, well, they didn't really lift as heavy as some other folks who do go above and beyond and kind of really internalize the essence of the project. Any other questions about the project before we start talking about benefit cost analysis? All right. So, thus far in the course, what we have emphasized is methods that allow you to maximize profitability. And kind of the baked-in assumption so far is that money is what counts, that it's profits above everything else, that you're choosing from among alternatives. There's option A, option B, and the way you choose between those alternatives is whatever gives you the highest present worth. But of course, the reality is in life, there are things that matter more than money, or maybe there's things in addition to money that matter. So money matters. It solves a lot of problems if you've got some money, but other things matter as well. Just as a couple of illustrations of that, all over the world, people are involved in charitable work. So they give away food, they give away health care, there's GoFundMe, there's things where people give away money, and that has not a great rate of return when it comes to trying to maximize the profits that go into your wallet. But yet people still do it, and so there must be some motivation other than maximizing profits that goes into charitable contributions. Here is a picture of a highway guardrail, and those are expensive, both in materials and installation costs. And so it would be just as easy to have a road with no guardrail, but what we collectively as a society have decided is that it's worth spending a little bit of extra money on safety precautions, that human life has value beyond the dollar cost of what a person is able to generate. And so highway guardrails is just an illustration that sometimes it's more than just about money. Sometimes it's about safety in addition to money. Anybody know what this is? Also, we're looking at a road, but what's this thing to the left?
Refract sound.
What does it do?
It keeps it quiet.
It keeps it quiet, yeah. So, highways can be really noisy, especially freeways where the traffic is moving 65, 75 miles an hour, and there's big trucks. It can generate a lot of noise, and so that the people who live on the other side of that road would be experiencing some unpleasant sounds that could interrupt their quality of life. Daniel?
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about because my grandmother lives near something that has a similar road structure. So she lives in a suburb near a highway.
Yeah, and these really work. These do reduce the noise, and so the idea here is that it must be worth spending a little bit of extra money for the improved quality of life. Environmental protection is another thing where it's free to litter in the ocean. It's free to throw a bottle or a wrapper in a river, but generally we avoid doing that because the purity of water and avoiding the waste is, most people agree, it's worth the added expense. So it's not always just about the money, and that's what this next phase of the course is about, is how do you make decisions when it's more than just the money that matters. When you're not trying to maximize profits, but you're trying to maximize benefit. And there's a difference between benefit and profits. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And this came to kind of a head. A lot of people started to realize that sometimes we have to do things that cost money for a social benefit, like when it comes to COVID and immunization. The United States is giving away millions and millions of dollars worth of vaccines across the world because it's beneficial to vaccinate people outside of this country because it also affects the economy, and it's the right thing to do to protect people from disease. So let's talk about different types of public sector projects, and that's what we're going to be analyzing with these new methods that I'm going to teach you about today. Public sector projects are a little bit different than private sector projects because in a public sector project, it's owned by a group of people, often the citizens who live in a municipal area or in a state. These are usually much larger projects than are undertaken by private companies. They have a longer timeline, and there's usually a big requirement for an upfront investment that would be difficult for a private company to come up with that much money. So, highways are notoriously expensive. A mile of highway may cost $4 or $5 million. So to go between two major cities would just be cost prohibitive for a private company to try and finance. These things you can think of as the foundations for a civilized society, where it's difficult to have a functional society without water treatment and an electrical grid and sewer treatment and so on. So all of these things are sometimes conducted on a non-profit basis or sometimes at a loss by organizations just because we know that it has to be there, and sometimes a private company can step in and provide these services, but it's often the case that it's better if a non-profit entity does it and isn't trying to maximize their profits. Sometimes a utility, for example, our electrical utility in this area is a for-profit company, but it's regulated by the State Public Utility Commission. So there's some places where electricity is generated by a government organization. I lived in a small city when I was in college, and the electricity there was provided by the city. And it was always cheap. They were just barely charging enough to cover their costs. And there are some for-profit companies that are able to engage in some of these, but public sector projects, what makes them unique is that you have to weigh things other than the profitability. There's multi-parameters that are kind of being balanced, the good of society in addition to the revenue that can be generated from a project. So the thing that unifies all these different types of projects is that they provide the service to the citizenry for no profit, or a regulated profit in the case of a utility. So here's just that list of compare and contrast, and I've already addressed some of these things that the private projects that we're acquainted with from earlier in this course generally have a shorter duration than public sector projects, where there are these big projects that will be in place for a long time, like a bridge or a road or a water network. And because they're going to last for so long, what makes them tricky is that the revenues they generate are so far in the future that they're being discounted many, many years, so their present value is relatively small. So think about if you have a bridge that will be in operation for 100 years, and it's a toll bridge, then those revenues 100 years in the future have virtually no contribution to the present value today. Even though it'll still be in operation, you're spending money today in order to get these future values that in present terms don't have much of a contribution. So another interesting comparison between public and private sector projects is that interest rates for public sector projects are relatively lower than the interest rates that are paid by for-profit companies. And the reason why is that a lot of these public sector projects are guaranteed by the credit of the government that undertakes the project. And so state governments, local governments, they can charge taxes on the people that live in their boundaries. And it's that ability to tax people that makes it a very secure investment for bond sellers, for people who are loaning money to a municipality. If you know that the government is able to legally force people to give you money, that's a very secure investment when you know that the person that you're loaning money to has the legal authority to take money from the people who live there. So The U.S. government, for instance, is able to borrow money over a 30-year period for about 1%. And there aren't too many private companies, if any, that would pay as little as 1% for loans that last 30 years, because there's no private company that has a revenue stream that's as secure as the federal government's legal right to tax people. So because of that, interest rates on public sector projects are generally lower than private sector companies, where the private company, maybe even if it has a long history of profitability and lots of contracts and customers, there's always the risk of default. Selection criteria here, it means how do you know which alternative to choose? Multiple criteria for the public sector projects just means that you're having to balance things like the noise pollution that could be caused by a project and the delay that could be caused by a project, or the many different stakeholders and groups that are being served by the solutions that are being generated, where when you're choosing between alternatives for a private sector project, it's just the rate of return or maximizing profits that tells you which alternative to choose. Environment of evaluation, the compare and contrast there is just that public sector projects sometimes will have open meetings where you can go and give your feedback as a community member. Let's say, for instance, if they're going to be rezoning a piece of property for a big high-rise development of condos, the county zoning board may have an open public meeting where people can come and provide their concerns, or there can be a lot of different stakeholders who each have a say on the decision that's finally made, whereas in the case of a private project, normally it's just an economic analysis, and they don't give so much emphasis to things like another ABET thing here. No, comma, I am not in the call, hyphen, just the evaluators and advisory board members. The private company just chooses projects on the basis of what's the most profitable, whereas in a public sector project, you're having to assess a wide range of concerns. And we'll get into some of those with the in-class exercise for today. So some of those concerns. Think about sitting in traffic. If there is a project for widening a freeway, then when they are trying to decide how many additional lanes to put in, one of the things that they would take into consideration is how much is your time worth if you're stuck in traffic. And so it's not that you actually charge people for sitting in traffic. It's not that you have to pay out of pocket, but if there is a benefit to a public sector project like reducing delay, then one of the techniques that they have to follow is trying to enumerate the benefit and quantify the value of what that project will be doing. So widening a freeway and adding more lanes, if you're going to be reducing how long it takes someone to drive home, so they've saved time, you have to quantify the value of that saved time by assigning a dollar cost to it. Even though the people, it's not a monetary exchange, you have to monetize the benefits in order to do comparisons between alternatives. So health is another thing where you have to sometimes monetize the benefits in order to compare alternatives. And so if you're comparing between hand sanitizer dispensers on the wall versus handing out hand sanitizer to every person who comes through the door, then you would compare how many fewer illnesses you could expect and then find out what is the value of someone not being sick, and quantify and monetize that value. And it could be, what's the value of their reduced suffering as they're ill. It could be what is the quantitative value of their being at work when they otherwise would be home. So it's sometimes a little bit of an art as much of a science as assigning a dollar value to these social goods, and especially in the case of recreation. So if there's a project that is meant to create some new recreational opportunities, like if there's boating due to a new dam that's being put in, or if You know, a dam is going to have a special fish release mechanism. You know, like they sometimes make a bypass for fish to still be able to spawn up and down a river. So if you're going to be spending money for something like that, the tricky thing that you have to ask yourself is, what is it worth on a dollar value, dollars per hour, for someone to be able to go fishing in a river? And so that, you know, that can be a tricky thing that economists will try and put a dollar value on, and then that goes into the benefits of the project when you're calculating the benefit to cost ratio. A similar thing is in the case of construction. If you're going to be delaying people while a new construction site is like all torn up and a business can't have cars going to it, then a project also needs to have its disbenefits quantified. And disbenefits are thought of as disadvantages from a project. And so in the case of widening a new freeway, there can be temporary delay over the course of maybe a year or 2 years, and then long-term less delay. And so it could be that a company is temporarily cut off from its customers while the road in front of that company is under construction. And so you have to quantify the economic disbenefits of these projects as well. So we've been talking about how you monetize the effects of a project, and that is that you take these kind of, they're a little bit squishy and qualitative things and turn it into a dollar value so that it can fit into the formula. And we classify the effects of a project as either benefits, disbenefits, and both of these are tricky to quantify, but the costs are relatively easy to quantify because that's going to be information that you get from a contractor who's bidding to undertake a project. And we could break the costs up into a couple of subcategories, like the initial upfront construction costs, which is usually at the present, and then maintenance and operation costs that exist over a recurring interval. So every year there might be annual maintenance and operations costs for a project. In order to put all of these things together in a formula, we need to take them to the same time frame. So we have to take all of the benefits, all of the disbenefits and costs to the present, for example, before we can compare them and do calculations with them. And so if the annual maintenance and operations costs are on an annual basis, then we need to take them to the present before we can combine them with the initial costs and do other calculations as well. In the formula I'm about to show you, it's already known that costs are outflows, and so you don't use a minus sign in the formula for the costs. And if you are going to do a project that results in a reduction in what you used to spend, savings in other words, then that would be subtracted from the cost if there's savings to the government from some impact of a project. So here's the formula for the conventional benefit to cost ratio, and let's look at what happens here. You've got the benefits of doing a project minus the disbenefits. So those are the undesirable consequences, the disbenefits. So in the numerator here, it's basically you've somehow quantified the good effect of a project when you subtract out the bad effect of a project. So that's in the numerator, and remember that we've quantified everything in terms of dollars. The good effects of a project expressed in dollars in the numerator. And then the denominator is the costs, and those are easy to put in terms of dollars. We've combined together the initial and the maintenance and operations costs. And so remember that the initial costs will usually be present, and maintenance and operation will usually be recurring, and so you'd need to convert the maintenance and operation to a present basis to add it together. Now the decision criteria is here. If the ratio is greater than or equal to 1, accept the project. Otherwise, meaning if the ratio is less than 1, then you should reject the project. Now think about why that is. It's saying that if you get $1.5 of benefit for $1 of cost, then you should do the project. So, I mean, that seems obvious when you put it that way. If you can spend $1 and get $1.50 of value, then that's a thumbs up. Accept the option. But then the reverse of that is that if your benefit is less than the cost, so if you spend $1 of cost but only get 45 cents of benefit, then that project is not justified because we've quantified the effects of the benefits and disbenefits, and we found that you're spending more than $1 in costs in order to get less than $1 of value. So that's why we have those decision criteria that way. So this is the conventional B2C formula. This is modified, the difference being just that we move the maintenance and operations costs up to the numerator in the modified. The criteria is the same. And then there's one other parameter that we sometimes analyze projects related to, and that is the profitability index. The profitability index has the benefits minus the maintenance and operations costs in the numerator, and then the initial costs in the denominator. And this would be used for a private partner who's engaged in a project along with a government agency, but they don't necessarily have to incur any of the disbenefits. So an example of that is the rec center here on campus. Did you know that the rec center is owned and operated by an organization other than the university? That Marshall doesn't actually own that rec center. It was built by a private company. They paid the money for it, and they got a contract that guaranteed that the students would be required to pay fees each semester to go to the rec. And so for that guaranteed source of income over, I think it's 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, they agreed to build the rec center, and then at the end of the 20 years, if I understand correctly, then the building gets turned over to the university. So that's a private partner that doesn't have any of the disbenefits.
Is that the same case as like the apartment complex that also has Marshall in the title of it?
I think so. Yeah, they sometimes build housing. That's a really common thing, where they'll build the housing, and after a certain number of years, they maybe will turn it over to the university, or they pay licensing to the university for the privilege, and then the university will kind of like advertise that housing on its website. And so in a case like that, the people who operate the concession don't have the disbenefits to worry about. So another example of that is there are some toll roads where private companies build and operate the toll road. And so they don't necessarily care about the noise that's generated or pollution from the water that runs off the roadway, because their perspective is just the profitability of the project and not necessarily the environmental or social impact. So that's just another way that we can sometimes apply these similar ideas of where you want to, in the numerator, have the benefits of the project, and the denominator have the cost, and then the decision criteria is that if you get more than $1 of benefits for $1 of costs, then the project is potentially acceptable. Okay, so today's in-class exercise is related to the evaluation of a proposed highway. Let me see if I can pull that up and have it up on the screen here. Benefit cost analysis, number 24. Okay, so a new highway is being considered. We know that a 4% discount rate applies, and I think the factor table's on the reverse side of the page. It's a 20-year period, and I give you the characteristics of the project, like how much it costs to build. This bullet point is related to the initial construction costs. We know about the annual maintenance and operation costs, the benefits, the disbenefits. So my first suggestion is start with a sketch of the cash flow diagram, just so you can see all of the time value of money conversions that are going to need to be made. and then calculate the present worth of the initial costs, all of these present worths you're calculating, so that then you can put it into the ratios and determine whether the project is justified. The decision criteria, remember, is if it's greater than or equal to 1, then the project is suitable. If it's not, then the project should be rejected. Okay, so I've done this cash flow diagram on the board just mainly so that we can see all the different pieces. This bullet point summary of what's happening, it could be easy to miss a certain amount. So we want to have the initial costs known. And so what I'm calling the initial cost is this construction component, the $4 million now, $18 million each year, and then the $4 million in year 5. So what I'm doing is I want to find out the present worth of those construction costs. And so the $4 million is already at times 0. And then we have $18 million a year through years 1 through 4. So there's $18 million that's each year, and it's the same amount. So I want to do a P/A. So that'll take the annual amount of $18 million and find the present equivalent of it. And it's for I equals 4%, N equals 4. And then the last part of that is there's the single $4 million amount out in year 5 that needs to be discounted to the present. So I'll multiply that by the factor lookup for a P/F at 4% interest rate and N equals 5. Okay, so there's 3 pieces. There's the $4 million, it's already at the present. And then if we go to the 4% table, and you look on the N equals 4 row in the column of P/A, the factor you'll find there is 3.6299. So that tells us that if you move the 4 payments of $18 million from spread out over time, discount it to the present, then the equivalent present amount is going to be $65.3382 million. And then the last part is the single future value that we discount to the present. So the $4 million that's in year 5, if we discount it to times 0, then that's 3.2876 million. I don't think the decimal came through very clearly when I scanned it. So altogether, the present value of the initial construction aspect of this project is $72.62 million. So we're going to do the same thing with maintenance and operation, take it to the present. The benefits to the present, disbenefits to the present. So it's just going to be, these table lookup factors to get everything to times 0, and then we can start putting into the ratios for the conventional and modified B to C, as well as the profitability index. And so let me pause again and allow you to continue your calculations. And when you get the numbers, why don't you check with me, because I've got the solution here, and let's see if we all agree on whether these projects are justified. Look. All right, so we found the present worth of the initial costs. This is good practice, right? Maybe you've forgotten these time value of money problems. Okay, so now if we want to find the maintenance and operation costs, it is $1 million a year for 20 years. So there's 20 $1 million payments, and we multiply it by the P/A lookup factor, which is 13.5903 from the back table. And so that's 13.5903 million. That's the maintenance and operation costs. The benefits has 2 pieces. There's $3 million a year that starts in year 1. So we can get that to the present pretty easily. We just do a P/A, and that finds the present equivalent of the $3 million. But the $5 million starts in year 11 and goes through 20. So there's 10 of them. But if you do a P/A, then it's going to take the amount to year 10. So then you need to get it from 10 to 0. So you'll notice here I've got the 5 million, first of all multiplied by the P/A factor. So that basically takes 10 payments of 5 million and finds the equivalent lump sum amount at year 10. And then this second factor here, the P/F, takes it from year 10 to year 0. So that's why we've got the two-step process there. So then the sum of the benefits is 51.73 million. And finally, the disbenefits are a little bit tricky because we've got the 10 million at year 1 that has to be taken to the present, the 5 million at year 2 that we're just going to do a P/F, and then doing the P/F for the $2 million that's at year 3. So if we take all of those disbenefits to the present, there's 16.016 million. Now the ratios, this project is not justified because the conventional B/C ratio says that for every dollar of cost, you only get 41 cents of benefit. So you're buying 41 cents and spending $1 to get it. So this project is not justified according to the conventional B/C ratio. According to the modified ratio, things look even worse. 30 cents of benefit for every dollar of cost. The profitability index is likewise pretty meager. The profitability index says that even when you ignore the effect of the disbenefits, the project isn't justified from the perspective of an external partner who can ignore the disbenefits. It doesn't work for them either. So this project is a big thumbs down all around. That's all I have for you today. I'll see you in class on Wednesday, and I'll scroll back up to these in case you need to take a look at the numbers a little bit longer than the 3 hours of Saturday.
There's another entrance off Howland's Mill.
Howell's Mill?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good place. There's a really cool waterfall over by there.
I've been doing that. There's that cave there.
Yeah, that's
That's kinda
a
cool.
waterfall. Yeah, it's just like a ledge open on one side.
It was almost like I didn't see any water coming out there, but
Well, when it's wet, and during the winter time, there's like a big icicle that'll form. It's really cool. I'm glad you're exploring it.
yeah.
That's great. Not sure if I recorded this as I was showing to the students, so let me bring it up on the screen for a minute.
I remember I looked at it at one point. I remember you said something about the